Good evening. My name is Jonathan Grant. I'm the Director of the Policy Institute here at King's College, London. And the Policy Institute has been hosting a series of lectures given by Professor Dominique Moisi over the last few months and going forward a few months on the title, What Went Wrong? The first lecture was on the rise of Asia and its interaction with the Western world, and the second was on the role of fear in contemporary geopolitics. And today, Dominique is going to address an even more complicated and challenging topic about the Middle East. His title, provocatively, is What Went Wrong with the Middle East? And here we're exploring a number of issues around fragmentation, radicalization, geographical expansion, and, in his words, state of mind. The Middle East is a state of mind and how that influences us. As many of you know, Dominique is the founder and senior advisor of the French Institute for International Relations. He's professor at Sciences Po and has been a visiting professor here at King's College, London, since 2012. He's a regular contributor on various news channels, and no doubt you've seen him on BBC News, France 24, various newspapers such as Financial Times. And I highly recommend his book for those of you who haven't seen it, on the geopolitics of emotion. A very interesting and stimulating read. So on that note, Dominique, I'll hand over to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The title of this lecture has already been chosen by Bernard Lewis when he published in 2001, a few months after 9/11, a book that was written before the tragic events of London and Washington, called What Went Wrong? And the subtitle of his book was Western Impact and Muslim Responses. And I thought I would start with Bernard Lewis to praise the scholar and to criticize the policy advisor, because he turned out to be one of the key, if not the key, orientalists of George W. Bush. In taking the long view on this topic, what went wrong, Bernard Lewis asks fundamental questions about Islam. And the first question he asks is the following: how come a civilization that dominated the world from the 6th to the 15th century after Christ, a civilization that had no rival except maybe the Chinese, stopped being what she was? And in their own interrogation on the subject, Muslim literature, Islamic literature, gives two kinds of answers. The first one, they did that to us, a kind of scapegoating process, which find a series of culprits. The Christian Republic, the imperial European powers, the West, the Zionists, the Jews, and some, by contrast, ask themselves another kind of question: what did we do wrong? What have we failed? And others, but according to Bernard Lewis, very few, ask themselves a third question. How can we redress what we do wrong? How can we get it right again? And of course, if you take the long view, as Bernard Lewis does, there are key events. The fall of Constantinople. And right after, the reports of the Venetian ambassadors saying, we are doomed. Christians will not exist in a few decades. The Venetian Republic will have to convert to Islam. And then, of course, a little more than 120 years later, in the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, the Christian fleet outweighs the fleet of the Ottoman Empire. And this event, which is dealt with heavily in Christian literature, is nearly ignored in Istanbul, as if nothing had happened. By contrast, the next event, which remains in history, which is the failure of the Ottoman to seize Vienna in 1683, is looked at very deeply by Ottoman and Islamic scholars. It has been a shock for them. It has been a terrible defeat. And from then on, they went on retreat. And it's interesting to look at the literature. When the West looked at this course of events, we tend to say the Islam was in full renaissance when we were in our Middle Ages. The moment we started our renaissance, they started their decline. But seen from the Ottoman Empire, it's not our renaissance that starts the decline. It's their failure to seize Vienna at the end of the 17th century. And since that moment, there has been a steady decline. The building up of a culture which I describe in my book, The Geopolitics of Emotion, as a culture of humiliation with its successive layers. And one of the key elements is a moment in European history, the Battle of Abu Qir, the defeat of the French fleet away of the city of Cairo in the sea, where Horace Nelson starts beating the French, became an habit, repeated 6 years later at the Battle of Trafalgar, of course. And this event has decided the fate of Egypt for more than 150 years. And this event has been seen as a deep frustration. How come the fate of Egypt be decided by the result of the battle between the French and the British? It means we lost control over our history. And if you take a significant moment in the 19th century, and even more so in the 20th century, you see a repetition of that failure to reconquer control over one's history. the Japanese and the Ottoman Empire engaged at the same time in a process of modernization. The Japanese succeeded, the Ottoman failed to redress the course of their history. And this is where I'm back to Bernard Lewis when he says, what has happened? What went wrong? How can you explain that? And he comes up with three kinds of explanation. The first one, it's not so much that Islam did badly, it is that the West did very well. So maybe they have nothing to reproach themselves except to look at the shift of history in one direction after the other. Other interpretation, which Bernard Lewis gives, quoting Islamic sources, it is what Islam did to Muslims. So emphasizing the impact of the religion on the civilization. And of course this has been said very often with three kinds of layers. The first one, the absence of a clear-cut distinction in Islam between what belongs to Caesar and what belongs to God. And the difficulty to recreate a working system, a working state system within that framework, plus the exclusion of women from any role, any significant role in society, which cuts 50% of the workforce. But then there is another element which is more interesting in retrospect, which Bernard Lewis quotes at length, and it is, you shouldn't ask the question what Islam did to Muslims. You should pose the exact opposite question. What have Muslims done to Islam? And this is, of course, an accusation on fundamentalism, on a kind of radicalization of Islam that developed with the course of decline, accelerating that process. And if you look at the 20th century, you can see again those layers of humiliation. Collapse of the last caliphate incarnated by the Ottoman Empire in 1924, the creation of the State of Israel, the defeat of the Arab armies in 1948, and somewhere even more humiliating, the Six-Day War in 1967. I remember a conversation I had in Cairo with a prominent Egyptian political figure saying very openly, how could the inheritors of the slave of Pharaoh defeat the inheritors of Pharaoh in 6 days? Then, of course, this permanent comparison in the framework of globalization with places that were below the Middle East in the early 1950s and who shoot up in the last 15 years, in particular in Asia. What have we failed here? What went wrong? And then, last but not least, the failure of the Arab Spring. And that sense of deep humiliation, even revolution, we failed. How what started as the Arab Spring ended in a very brutal, cruel manner nearly everywhere except Tunisia. And we'll come back to Tunisia later on. Here again, there is that sense of gloom and doom with the interaction of explanation coming from the outside and interpretation coming from the inside. They did it to us, we did it to ourselves. A kind of dialectical process. In fact, at the end of his book, What Went Wrong, Bernard Lewis starts to allude to the advice he will give to George W. Bush in the months that will follow 9/11. He says, well, by the end of the day, maybe the key reasons for the state of Islam in the Middle East is the absence of freedom. If they had more freedom, and he recognizes it's going to be a very difficult process, democracy was to come to the Middle East, then progress will return. I remember very well, in 2002, I was in a group of so-called strategic thinkers, an offshoot of the World Economic Forum in Davos. And there was a younger Orientalist who said to me, as a private joke, and I did realize it was not so much a joke than preparation for what was to come. The terrorists came from Saudi Arabia and Egypt, but we can't make war to Saudi Arabia and Egypt, so we'll make war to Iraq. And he explained to us, this little group, that Iraq was a center of civilization. Civilization started at Sumer, said the historian Kramer. So if we push democracy in Baghdad, incredible things are going to be possible. And this man had this sentence, democracy in Baghdad will bring peace to Jerusalem, with the following interpretation. Arabs cannot accept Israel because they don't accept themselves. The moment they accept themselves, the moment they are pleased with themselves as being normal Democrats, they will accept Israel. And the rest is history. And the rest, you know, was a mixture of fallacy and arrogance. As a Frenchman, there was something in my head that came haunting me, which is the memories of the Algerian War. We knew what it means to do something for others without consulting them. I want to save you. I know what is good for you. But I don't accept you to enter into that process. And this is where we are today. And where we are today is, of course, a new Middle East, which I could try to characterize and analyze along three key words: fragmentation, radicalization, and expansion. Fragmentation is easy to see James Barr, recently published, which is an excellent book, have been challenged by the actors on the ground. And what we see today is the explosion of states whose boundaries, whose legitimacy have been created by Western colonial officers or Western diplomats. And from Syria to Iraq, from Iraq to Libya, and further up in Yemen, there are states who no longer exist as coherent, integrated entities. Each country is a specific case. You can't compare the fate of Iraq with the fate of Libya, the fate of Syria with the fate of Yemen, but they all are facing the same situation. And when you try to analyze the root causes of that fragmentation, here again you are confronted with a series of explanations. In the case of Syria, it is clear to me that the extraordinary cruelty of the regime has led to the situation we are in. And now, when Bashar al-Assad presents himself as the only decent alternative to jihadists, we have to ask ourselves fundamental questions. Can we really close our eyes on what he did to his own people before? By not supporting with clarity the moderate opposition forces who did exist at the very beginning, haven't we condemned ourselves to this impossible choice between Daesh, ISIS, and Bashar al-Assad? In Libya, we are confronted with another situation, which is that we were strong enough to overthrow Gaddafi's regime without too much regret by anyone, even in the Arab world. But then we disinterested ourselves from what would happen next. The Americans, when they realized how costly the thing would be, and the British don't seem to have been involved in the military operation next to the French with the help of the Americans, and there is a resounding silence of London on the situation prevailing in what was Libya yesterday. Yemen, a different case story. You see at work the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And you don't want to intervene between those two giants who are left to face each other. Iraq, we're back to something else. And we are back to something which in many ways is fundamental to understand the birth and the growth of Daesh. In fact, one should not only emphasize the responsibility of the West in explaining what went wrong, but we should not hide to ourselves the reality that we played a role, and that role has been far from being positive. Ask Sunni radicals, Salafis who joined Al-Qaeda or Daesh and engage in a morbid competition for the organization that will appear more crude, more barbaric to the eyes of others. And you see, again, a continuity of explanation. What do they say? First, you abandon us to our fate in the 1990s in the former Yugoslavia because we were Muslims. You did not care about the fate of Bosnia until it was too late. And after having abandoned us to our fate in Bosnia, you destroyed us, segregated us, and abandoned us to the Shiite and Iran in Iraq. How come a country like the United States of America betrays its faithful allies in the Gulf and makes of Iran the only winner? Then you have Syria, which I mentioned. Back to the 1990s, you abandon us again. And the comparison between the Syrian situation and the Spanish Civil War seems very clear to me. On the one hand, you have countries such as Iran and Russia supporting without any moral hesitation the regime of Bashar al-Assad, like Nazi Germany and fascist Italy were supporting the Franco revolutionaries in Spain at the time of the Spanish Civil War. And on the other side, you have hesitant democracies. Why so? Because in both cases, they have a feeling that the threat coming from elsewhere is probably more important. In the 1930s, the threat was communism. In the 2010, the threat was Islamism, fundamentalism. And as a result, we've seen what's happening. That does not mean that Daesh is an irresistible force. In fact, I think we see the contrary taking place in front of our eyes. Daesh has been incredibly good and efficient in terms of propaganda, in terms of manipulating public opinion through the modern use of modern technologies. But Daesh is on the defensive. According to modern immediate results, quoted by many sources, they've lost 25% of the territories they used to control and 75% of the resources they have. So they are not an irresistible threat, to the contrary. But they exert a fascination which is very dangerous and which we must understand. And this is where I come to my third point. After fragmentation and radicalization, we see an expansion of the Middle East, what I call the Middle East as a state of mind. The Middle East and Salafist ideologies exerting a kind of very dangerous attraction on many young people who are looking for a meaning to their life. a meaning which fighting in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya, or returning from those countries with some kind of rapid, quick course in destruction of others and preparation for suicide reveals itself very dangerous. We saw that recently in Paris, in Brussels, and last week, of course, in Tunisia, a country that has attacked precisely because it had voted for democracy, precisely because it was the only country where the Arab Spring seemed to have some meaning, and of course targeting the Westerners, the tourists, a key source of funding for a very weak economy. Let me, for the sake of time, turn to two other key issues which I haven't touched upon and which are integral part of the topic. And it's further justified to deal with them because of the calendar. The first question is Israel-Palestine after the re-election of Netanyahu in Israel. And the second question is relationship between Iran and the West on the eve of what may be an agreement between them and us. What happened to Israel is, in a way, logical, could be expected. Israel has moved, as some people have said. But Israel has moved like other democracies. You see a move to the right in nearly all Western democracies. Why should it be the case in Israel too? And the explanation of all these phenomena is the same. The predominance of a culture of fear. When you fear something, you tend to be more conservative. You tend to look for more protective personalities. You say to yourself, I can't take the risk of changing. But the problem, of course, in the choice made by Israel is that it is contributing further to the isolation of Israel in the world. And it may be the tipping point of a process of divorce between Israel and its main supporter and ally, the United States of America. Netanyahu is undeniably a great tactician, a very able politician. He can win elections. But could he be also a very poor strategist? Just the opposite of Lee Kuan Yew, who just died in Singapore. There was a time when the dream of Shimon Peres, former president of Israel, was to make of Israel the Singapore of the Middle East, a model, a carrier. Well, that dream seems so far away today, nearly an abstraction, as if it never happened. And Israel is confronted with intractable challenges which are not going to disappear if the two-state solution is no longer an option. And it is essential in my mind to stick to a fundamental assertion, which is that the security of Israel rests above all on the legitimacy of Israel. and the legitimacy of Israel is keenly dependent on the existence next to Israel of a Palestinian state or of decent, acceptable conditions given to the Palestinians. And this is clearly not going to be the case. Can Israel afford to be accused, and this time legitimately, of practicing some kind of apartheid? Would be very difficult. Which brings me to the second issue, that of Iran. I had recently, in fact last week, conversations with diplomats very close to the negotiation, both French and British. And they came to the same conclusion, which is as follows. If nothing goes wrong in the negotiation, if no side makes a mistake in the final days, we probably are very close to an agreement. An agreement which, to go to the essential, we mean that it will take at least 1 year for Iran to turn its nuclear capacities into some kind of military nuclear force, and a reduction of the number of centrifuges. I don't know how you pronounce that term in English, and I apologize for my French accent. And why so? In a way, they are very close, probably, to an agreement, but with different interests in mind. The negotiation is in the West totally dominated by the United States. It is one of the key reasons why Paris looks at it with a certain distance, because we are not really part where it matters, nor is London, nor is any other actor. It's something between Washington and Tehran. And I think that for President Obama, an agreement on nuclear things with Iran, which could lead to a process of normalization with Iran, is fundamental if he wants to enter history with a legacy of a transformist president. He would have globally restored relationship with Cuba and restored some kind of relationship with Iran. And Iran is key in the fight against Daesh. If there is a process of reconquest taking place in Iraq today, it is largely sent to Iran and directly the Iranian troops who are playing in Iraq the role that Kurds have played in Syria. And from the other side, one should say that sanctions have hurt deeply Iranian, that there is a growing process of discontent within the Iranian population, and there, of course, we can see the tensions that exist in Iran between those who deeply want a process of normalization with the United States of America and those who fear that process because they see in it the beginning of the doom of the Ayatollah regime. And this is where we are, a unique region that goes beyond its boundaries, that is obsessing us in terms of imagination, but not only imagination, and that is extraordinarily close to us in geographic terms. a state of chaos, or worse, an Islamic state in Libya is, of course, something that Europe cannot accept. And I go back to the conclusion I gave last week when I spoke of what went wrong with Europe, say, faced with the combined threat of jihadism in the south and Putinism in the east, Europe has to start thinking of becoming a hard power. Can you do that? That is another story. I think I've been too long. I apologize.
Well, thank you very, very much, Dominique. I learned lots of things there and stimulated lots of thoughts. We have time for some questions. We do have a microphone, so if we could maybe start in the centre here. I'll try to work around the auditorium.
Right, thank you very much. How do you foresee developments in Egypt?
Yes.
We'll take these two and then we'll take all right.
Okay, thank you very much. My question is more like the internal problems in the Middle East. Meaning, a long time before the establishment of the nation of Israel or America or anything like that, what's the main internal problems? I mean, the Sunni-Shia divide, I guess you cover it more like the external problem. That's a question of like us.
Well, on Egypt, one of the key problems in that entire region is the despotic nature and corrupt nature of the regime. If you go back to the starting point of what was called initially the Arab Spring, you see the encounter between two sets of process. The first one is demography and economics. The largest generation of baby boomers arrives on the market for jobs at a time when there are no jobs, when the Middle East is affected by the financial and economic crisis that has beset the West starting in 2007. And of course, this has literal consequences for their way of life. If food has become too expensive, if you can't feed your children, especially if they are very young, you take to the streets out of absolute despair. And the second process is the connection between politics and ethics. I don't know whether this story is true or not, and no one will prove it. But it has been said that on the last day of his tenure in power, the president of Tunisia, Ben Ali, calls his closest advisor. He just spoke on television, and the crowd are still coming onto the presidential palace. Desperate, he says, what can I do? And his closest advisor said, nothing, it's too late. You should have divorced earlier. Cutting himself from the atmosphere of corruption, spread and accelerated by the family of his wife. To a large extent, the same thing happened in Egypt. And, but we were probably victim of a problem of focus, like in a camera. because of CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, we saw the Tahrir Square and the people on the Tahrir Square, and we saw they were Egypt, that they were representing all of Egypt. They were not. The people in the countryside, the large majority of Egyptians, did not really follow what happened in Tahrir Square. And when the free election came, the Muslim Brothers were democratically elected. And the Democrats on Tahrir Square, we felt so close to them, were marginalized. They had the feeling their revolution was stolen from them. But then the Morsi regime proved to be at the same time intolerant and incompetent. And when a counter-revolution, in fact a coup d'etat, took place, when the army deposed him and took power again in a more brutal manner than at the time of Mubarak, it was probably supported by a majority of the Egyptian population that was fed up with the incompetence of the Muslim Brotherhood. So, this is the situation we are in. Egypt is the middle empire of the Middle East for demographic, historical, cultural reasons. It has a pre-Islamic culture it is very proud of and very, which is still present. I mean, I remember being in Cairo, visiting the museum, seeing the script, and then entering the foreign ministry at the time of Niggi. It was the same person. The roots were there. Egypt is key. But how can we push Egypt to evolve in a more liberal direction when we have absolutely no margin of maneuver? Just the opposite. So in fact we exchange an aging autocratic regime, starting to not to be liberal, but to be opened by inefficiency for a much tougher one. On Shiite and Sunni, yes, of course, and one of the key problems we're faced with is the fact that the majority, the Sunnis, tend to behave as minority in their mindset, with some kind presently of nearly an inferiority complex. We were the one to be defeated. We were the one to suffer losses. And from that standpoint, it is logical that out of this culture of diffidence should come out the most radical forces, which tend to be Sunni more than Shia. But of course, this division is magnified by the rivalry that exists between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which brings us back to the nuclear issue. If Iran were to become a nuclear power tomorrow, the entire Middle East will be witnessing a process of nuclear proliferation, because Saudi Arabia, Egypt, probably Turkey, would follow the same paths. Do we want that world to exist, or do we want to stop it as much as we can? And I think the answer seems to be clear-cut.
We have two questions on the left over here.
Hi, I'm afraid I'm not a student anymore. I'm a pollster, and I'm tracking government activities in Iraq. because if you look at the Sunnis over the last few years, they clearly have a deep resentment towards their previous Maliki government. You have to understand that in 2009, 80% of Sunnis in Iraq self-identified as an Iraqi. How do you describe yourself? I'm an Iraqi, and that coincides very strongly with a lot of campaigns that have been happening at the time. By 2011, it was 60%. Last year, it was 40%. So they're calling themselves Sunnis, or Muslims, religious. So I guess my question is, do we go back to some kind of crazy Nigerian switching between Sunni, Shia, Muslim, Christian? What's the future for Iraq? That's a good question.
Oh yes, it's a tough one.
I wonder the professor will agree with me that one of the cardinal mistakes was made by Anglo-American during the time of Musabe, where democracy was there. And Iran has never invaded any foreign country. Its record of civilization and its sophistication is bar none. And the failure on the part of the Anglo-American to give latitude to Saudi Arabia to flood the Western countries with Salafi literature, the building of the madrasas and all that. I think there is a time, whether you will agree with me or not, that Anglo-Americans should take a very hard line towards Saudi Arabia and bring about a sort of a renaissance in Islam, because Iran and Shia, though they are minority, have what much more advanced civilization than Sunnis.
So let's take these two questions and I'll take two more afterwards.
On Iraq, yeah, there is a danger that the key forces fighting Daesh would be only Shiite. And there is a risk that in their successful advances, they would kill as many Sunnis as possible, whether they are with Daesh or not. And that is why I was very happily surprised when I saw, not long ago in the Financial Times, a long study of someone who had been on the ground with the forces fighting Daesh in Iraq. There were people coming from civil society, doctors, engineers. They had taken arms after the collapse of the Iraqi army. They had been buying with their own money their Kalashnikov. They were half Sunnis, half Shiites, and they were making progress. And their commander was saying, what we are doing here is fighting a global war for you. But don't be mistaken. The majority of Islam is behind us and not behind them. That's very optimistic. Whether they can do it, I don't know. The key element will be in the months to come. The attack on Mosul. If Mosul is taken back from Daesh soon, before the summer, then we can look with more optimism at the future of Iraq. But we see how difficult the retaking of Tikrit is already. Mosul will be much, much more difficult. On Iran, well, I would fully agree with you that the Mossadegh incident was not one of the high mark of Western diplomacy. And in fact, the Iranian regime, after the seizure of power by the Ayatollah and all along the process of negotiation with the West on nuclear issues, have used Mossadegh as a permanent line of argument. But I sense, like you, that the ground for rapprochement with Iran is much bigger, much deeper. In fact, Iranians have not been humiliated in the last 30 years by the association between the West and authoritarian regime. The West paid lip service to democracy and supporting despotic and corrupt regime in the Arab world. So there's no anti-Western feeling. In spite of the declaration of the most highest religious authorities, there's no anti-Semitism in Iran. It's not the key issue. They don't define themselves vis-à-vis the existence of that foreign body that is supposed to be Israel. For the rest, yes, there's a great civilization that is Iran, that is incarnated by not so great a regime for the last 35 years. But it has been a very resilient regime.
I think there has been a failure by the West to understand the religious aspect. Iran regards as Islam is very urbane and also prepared to accommodate Sunnis. In fact, if you go back to the Prophet times, the agitation, you see, about the Karbala and all that, the West has not really studied the very Islamic doctrines of Iran, Shia and Sunni. And this is where there is responsibility on the part of the West to bring about a real rapprochement, not rely on the oil from Saudi Arabia, because it is Saudi Arabia that is responsible for the ills of the world.
Yeah, there's a gentleman here. Yeah, are you still interested?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, and I'll take one more after that. So the lady.
I'm sorry, I have to go to
we can pick that up afterwards. Yeah.
Basically, I just like to go back to the professor's speech about the Ottoman Empire and they defeat Vienna. But in actual fact, the Ottoman governments of the Caliphs did nothing but the Muslim countries that they occupied, including Iraq, where I come from. And I remember that in the First World War, when I remember that from my fathers and grandfathers, that Iraq and the Muslim population in Iraq, we were very glad when the Ottoman Empire, when the Ottoman rulers were defeated in Iraq. So Islam, that's what is, they say about Islam, they feel because they didn't get to the Yemen. But in actual fact, the Muslim population of Iraq were glad that they kicked the Ottoman rulers out in order to build a new country. Unfortunately, even though it started well with the King Faisal I in 1958, they actually made great strides in education, in health, and so on, and prosperity. It was cut short by a coup in 1958 and subsequent coming to power of different military rulers. So I don't believe that Islam or Muslims in general has that animosity because they didn't reach Vienna. It just basically developed
comment, ask Dominique to reflect on that. There is one question up on the top on the left, and that'll be our final question. So can we make this a question?
On Tunisia, I think what went right was the closeness of the country to Europe. There were so many contacts Tunisians had with countries on the other side of the Mediterranean. The openness to women played an important role at all levels of society, and in a way a comparison between Tunisia and the end of the Franco regime in Spain. The authoritarianism in political terms was there, but the society was open economically and to a large extent socially. On top of it, Tunisia is small, and at that level, small can be beautiful. But of course, it's too early to make a final judgment. But on revolution at large and comparison with Arab Spring, one of the most interesting comments I heard in 2011 was made by Professor Henri Laurence, who is teaching at the Collège de France in Paris, and who had the following analysis. He says, it's likely that it will fail because so many forces are playing against the process. But it's like 1953 in the Soviet Union. The generation that will have gone through the so-called Arab Spring will keep it with them. And he quoted Gorbachev, who would not have been Gorbachev without what happened in the Soviet Union in 1953. So look further. It may not have been decisive this time, but it will be essential to understand when it takes place next time. And I think that's a very interesting historical analogy. It doesn't come spontaneously to your mind. We've been thinking of so many other comparisons, but this one struck me because it was made in 2011 as a very deep one. And last word on Vienna, when I made my comments on the failure of the Ottoman to seize Vienna, I was quoting their sources. They considered that as a considerable failure. For them, there was before and after 1683.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. Maybe we can show appreciation to Dominique. Just to say, the next lecture in this series is on the 6th of May, and it's titled What Went Wrong with the Emerging World. So thank you.